He's told 10 News despite ample warning of trouble, the incident was left in the hands of just 2 officers. Reporter Joe Hill has more.
What really happened inside the Royal Pines ballroom that night, and why did it reshape the Gold Coast's criminal power map? On March 18, 2006, a kickboxing tournament turned into a controlled explosion of gunfire, blades, and fractured alliances. But the violence was not random. It was the visible rupture of a territorial war already in motion. Inside the Gold Coast turf wars, Hells Angels versus Finks, the brutal ballroom blitz explained is not about chaos. It is about calculated expansion, betrayal, and structural takeover.
Early morning bikie brawl. Police released vision of the fight, which shows as many as 20 members of the Finks descending on the club here to target members of the Hells Angels with bar stools.
Before the ballroom blitz, the real battle was not about ego, it was about geography. The Gold Coast was more than a tourist destination. By the early 2000s, it had evolved into one of Australia's densest nightlife economies. Nightclubs, strip venues, gym networks, private security contracts, and cocaine distribution pipelines formed a layered revenue structure. Control over the glitter strip meant control over consistent cash flow. The Finks had spent years consolidating that territory. Originally founded in Adelaide in 1969, the club's Gold Coast chapter, established in 1986, operated modestly at first. But as the 1990s closed, internal leadership shifted. Younger, more aggressive members assumed authority. The organization's posture changed from a local motorcycle fraternity to a structured criminal enterprise. Extortion increased. Drug trafficking expanded. Enforcers operated as intimidation units. By 2000, the Finks were no longer peripheral players. They were entrenched. This consolidation created a problem for the Hells Angels. While the Angels had built a dominant presence in Melbourne and Sydney and maintained strength in Brisbane, the Gold Coast remained outside their direct influence. Expansion was not symbolic, it was strategic. The Gold Coast connected interstate trafficking corridors to nightlife consumption markets. Any club controlling it could leverage both supply and distribution. The Hells Angels did not rely solely on traditional recruitment when entering hostile territory. Their expansion model in Australia had often involved patching over members from existing clubs. Instead of building new chapters slowly, they inserted themselves into established networks by persuading insiders to defect. This method destabilized rivals while accelerating territorial penetration. On the Gold Coast, however, the Finks' internal loyalty network was strong. Street-level recruitment would not be enough. To disrupt the structure, the Angels required someone positioned within the Finks' operational hierarchy, someone with access to logistics, personalities, and vulnerabilities. The glitter strip was not contested in open combat at first. It was contested through infiltration, and by late 2004, the Angels had found the leverage point they needed. The war did not begin inside a ballroom. It began with a transfer of allegiance. The defector who opened the gate, Christopher Wayne Hudson, was not an outsider drifting between clubs. He was embedded, a former Gold Coast bouncer with direct ties to nightlife security and street-level enforcement. Hudson had risen within the Finks structure during the period when the club was consolidating power along the coast. He understood how revenue moved. He knew which members handled collection, who maintained supply channels, and how disputes were managed internally. That knowledge carried weight. In outlaw motorcycle culture, allegiance is structural. Membership is not symbolic. It binds hierarchy, territory, and identity. Patching over from one club to another fractures that structure. It signals weakness to rivals and creates instability inside the original organization. When Hudson defected to the Hells Angels in late 2004, it was not a quiet resignation, it was a public rupture. More damaging than the defection itself was what followed. Hudson did not simply switch colors and step aside. He reportedly attempted to recruit additional Finks members to join him under the Hells Angels banner. That act moved beyond personal choice. It became a strategic penetration. If even a small number of insiders crossed over, operational knowledge and loyalty networks would shift with them. For the Finks, the defection represented both humiliation and exposure. An insider now sat with a rival club that had been attempting to expand into their territory for years. The Angels, in turn, gained something more valuable than manpower. They gained access, internal routines, informal alliances, vulnerabilities in enforcement coverage, all became potential leverage points. Retaliation was not immediate, but tension intensified. Through 2005, surveillance between the clubs increased. Residences associated with members were targeted in drive-by shootings. Movement patterns changed. Members began traveling in tighter formations. The conflict had not yet reached open confrontation, but both sides were preparing. The importance of Hudson's defection was not emotional. It was structural. The Angels had secured an entry point into a fortified territory. The Finks had lost internal insulation. From that moment forward, any public encounter between the clubs carried the weight of unresolved betrayal. By early 2006, the Gold Coast was no longer stable ground. It was layered with suspicion. One miscalculation in a crowded room would be enough to convert tension into violence. And that miscalculation arrived inside Royal Pines Resort. A ballroom filled with rivals, Royal Pines Resort was not chosen as a battlefield. On the weekend of March 18, 2006, it hosted a kickboxing tournament that drew more than 1,800 spectators. Fighters, promoters, tourists, local patrons, and club affiliates filled the ballroom. It was a public setting, controlled, visible, and not designed for confrontation. That is precisely what made it volatile. Outlaw motorcycle clubs often operate with awareness of shared spaces. Major public events can bring rival members into proximity without prior coordination. On that night, members of the Hells Angels and the Finks entered the same venue without expecting the other to be present. The ballroom became neutral ground only in theory. In practice, it was a compressed territory. Hudson attended the event seated alongside Hells Angels members. For the Finks, that image alone carried symbolic weight. A former insider is now positioned openly with a rival club inside a public venue on the Gold Coast. It was a direct visual reminder of the breach that had been festering for over a year. The conditions were unstable. Multiple interstate members were visiting. Alcohol was flowing. The clubs had experienced months of escalating hostility that had not yet been resolved. The tension was layered but contained until recognition triggered reaction. When Finks' enforcers identified Hudson ringside, the encounter shifted from passive hostility to immediate confrontation. The proximity removed the distance. There was no buffer of separate clubhouses or guarded premises. There were no controlled entry points or reinforced doors. The confrontation would unfold inside a crowded ballroom filled with civilians. The violence did not begin with firearms. It began with physical contact. A punch was thrown at Hudson. In that moment, the accumulated tension of infiltration, retaliation, and territorial pressure surfaced publicly. Within seconds, fists multiplied, chairs were lifted. Bodies surged toward the center of the room. The environment magnified the escalation. Confined space, limited exits. Hundreds of bystanders are attempting to retreat simultaneously. The room that had been configured for spectatorship became a pressure chamber. The confrontation did not remain physical for long. Weapons were introduced, and, once that threshold was crossed, the ballroom ceased to be an event venue. It became the first overt battleground of the Gold Coast turf war. The night violence went public. Once weapons entered the confrontation, the structure of the conflict changed permanently. Gunshots were fired inside the ballroom. Knives were drawn. Chairs, bottles, and anything within reach were used as blunt instruments. The fight was no longer a contained clash between opposing members. It became a violent eruption in a confined public space. 3 men were shot, 2 were stabbed. Hundreds of civilians were forced to dive beneath tables or rush toward exits. Panic spread faster than the confrontation itself. Security struggled to contain the surge. The noise of gunfire inside an enclosed venue amplified the chaos. The violence that had been building privately for months was now exposed in front of nearly 2,000 witnesses. Christopher Hudson was among those shot. He sustained gunshot wounds to the chin and back, but survived. Shane Bowden was later identified as the individual responsible for shooting him, an act widely interpreted as retaliation for Hudson's defection. The shooting was not random. It was targeted, focused, and symbolically charged. Law enforcement responded rapidly, but the damage had already been done. Media coverage circulated images of the melee nationwide. The phrase "ballroom blitz" became shorthand for one of Australia's most visible biker confrontations. What had been a controlled turf war, operating through intimidation and isolated retaliation, was now a public spectacle. The significance of the event was not limited to injuries or arrests. It marked the moment when the rivalry transitioned from shadow conflict to open hostility. The Gold Coast was no longer a territory quietly contested through infiltration and intimidation. It had become a public battleground. For both clubs, the implications were immediate. Reputation, dominance, and retaliation cycles intensified. For law enforcement, the event triggered a reassessment of the scale and organization of outlaw motorcycle networks operating in Queensland. The ballroom incident did not conclude the conflict. It removed any ambiguity about its existence. From that night forward, the turf war would escalate with fewer restraints and broader consequences. Sentences, signals, and unfinished business. In the months following the ballroom blitz, criminal proceedings addressed the immediate acts of violence. Shane Bowden received a 6-year prison sentence for his role in the shooting of Christopher Hudson. Another participant, known for using a chair as a weapon during the melee, was sentenced to more than 2 years for grievous bodily harm. Several others faced charges tied to the confrontation. On paper, the legal response appeared decisive. But court sentences did not neutralize the underlying dispute. The prosecutions targeted individuals, not the structural rivalry between clubs. The territorial issue remained unresolved. Hudson survived the shooting, and his continued affiliation with the Hells Angels ensured that the symbolic breach within the Finks was still active. No reconciliation followed. No de-escalation framework emerged. Instead, the public exposure hardened positions. The ballroom blitz had embarrassed both clubs in different ways. The Finks had failed to prevent a defector from operating openly within their territory. The Hells Angels had been drawn into a high-profile confrontation that intensified law enforcement scrutiny. Retaliation cycles did not dissipate. They recalibrated. Through the late 2000s, associated properties were targeted in arson attacks and shootings. Tattoo studios, gyms, and residences connected to either group became pressure points. The violence was no longer confined to spontaneous confrontation. It became strategic, dispersed, and persistent. Each side tested the other's ability to defend space without triggering full-scale police intervention. For the Hells Angels, maintaining forward momentum was critical. A failed expansion would signal weakness not just locally, but across interstate charters. For the Finks, allowing further infiltration risked erosion of authority along the Gold Coast. The conflict was no longer centered on one man's defection. It was about structural dominance. Law enforcement units began intensifying intelligence operations. Surveillance increased. Organized crime squads mapped affiliations and tracked interstate movements. The rivalry had moved beyond an isolated event. It had become an operational concern with statewide implications. The ballroom blitz did not end the war. It clarified it. Sentences were delivered, but control of the Gold Coast remained contested, and neither side intended to retreat. Pressure from above.
To engage those that had been involved in the fight. Police wouldn't comment on camera today, but they did move to defend their response time, saying that units were here within 2 to 4 minutes.
The aftermath of the ballroom blitz not only intensified hostility between the Hells Angels and the Finks, it also amplified internal expectations within both organizations. Outlaw motorcycle clubs operate within layered hierarchies that extend beyond local chapters. International charters observe territorial disputes closely. Success or failure in expansion carries reputational consequences far beyond one city. For the Hells Angels, the Gold Coast represented unfinished business. They had secured a defector, endured a public confrontation, and absorbed increased police attention. What they had not secured was clear territorial control. Failure to respond decisively after Royal Pines risked signaling weakness to rival clubs and to their own interstate leadership. In outlaw motorcycle networks, perceived hesitation can fracture authority. The Logan chapter of the Hells Angels was considered vulnerable in the immediate years following the ballroom blitz. Membership numbers were limited, and sustained retaliation against the Finks did not materialize in a visible way. Within the broader Angels structure, this created internal pressure. Expansion into the Gold Coast required reinforcement. In 2012, senior Hells Angels figures from Sydney were granted nomad status and relocated to spearhead renewed consolidation efforts. A chapter was established in Burleigh Heads, strategically positioned within contested territory. The premises were fortified, security cameras were installed, entry points were controlled. This was not a symbolic presence, it was structural entrenchment. The Finks, meanwhile, faced mounting external scrutiny. Law enforcement attention intensified after 2006, and public tolerance for large-scale biker confrontations declined. The clubs were no longer operating in relative obscurity. The ballroom blitz had altered perception. The Gold Coast was no longer just a nightlife economy, it was a flashpoint. The rivalry had evolved from a reaction to betrayal into a sustained contest for dominance. Both organizations adjusted their strategy. Movement patterns became more deliberate. Public appearances were calculated. The war was no longer loud at every moment, but it was constant. The next turning point would not come from another ballroom, it would come from legislation, and it would reshape the entire battlefield. The legislative shockwave. By 2013, Queensland's government introduced the Vicious Lawless Association Disestablishment Act, a sweeping legislative response targeting outlaw motorcycle gangs. The law designated specific clubs as criminal organizations and imposed severe mandatory sentencing enhancements for members involved in criminal activity. It was not aimed at one confrontation, it was designed to dismantle entire structures. The Hells Angels were among the 26 clubs formally designated under the legislation. The Finks were equally exposed. The law disrupted normal operating models. Members faced intensified surveillance. Associations themselves could trigger legal consequences. The traditional advantage of operating through collective identity became a liability. For the Finks, the pressure was immediate and existential. Continued operation under their banner carried escalating risk. In October 2013, a large-scale patchover agreement was brokered with the Mongols Motorcycle Club. Approximately 90% of Finks members transitioned under Mongols' colours. It was one of the largest amalgamations in Australian outlaw motorcycle history. The shift was strategic. Rebranding under a different charter allowed members to temporarily reposition within the altered legal environment. But structurally, it fractured the original Finks' identity that had dominated the Gold Coast in the early 2000s. The club that had once controlled the glitter strip effectively dissolved into a new configuration. The Hells Angels, despite being designated under the same legislation, had already entrenched their presence along the coast. Their earlier infiltration strategy and reinforced chapter development in Burleigh Heads positioned them to absorb the regulatory shock more effectively. Law enforcement assessments in subsequent years indicated the Hells Angels had become the most active club operating on the Gold Coast. The legislative intervention did not end the rivalry, it altered its architecture. The battlefield shifted from open confrontation to adaptive restructuring. And in that restructuring, the balance of territorial control tilted. The ballroom blitz had exposed the conflict. The legislation reshaped it. But the consequences of betrayal and retaliation were not finished unfolding. The cost of switching sides. Christopher Hudson survived the ballroom blitz, but survival did not stabilize his trajectory. 14 months after the confrontation at Royal Pines, his violent conduct surfaced again, this time outside the framework of motorcycle club rivalry. In June 2007, in Melbourne's central business district, Hudson assaulted his girlfriend in public. When two bystanders intervened, he drew a firearm and shot all three. One of the men, solicitor Brendan Kaler, died at the scene. Hudson later pleaded guilty to murder and received a life sentence with a non-parole period of 35 years. The event reframed his role in the Gold Coast turf war. Hudson had been the defector whose patchover destabilized territory and ignited retaliation. Now, he became a convicted murderer serving life imprisonment. The individual who symbolized strategic betrayal was permanently removed from the landscape he helped disrupt. For the Hells Angels, Hudson's imprisonment severed a link to the original infiltration strategy. For the former Finks, now largely absorbed into the Mongols, the personal vendetta associated with his defection lost its direct target. Yet the structural consequences remained. His switch had already forced a public confrontation. It had accelerated law enforcement scrutiny. It had contributed to the destabilization that ultimately preceded legislative intervention. Hudson's trajectory underscores a broader pattern within outlaw motorcycle conflicts. Individual actors can trigger structural shifts, but once those shifts occur, the conflict no longer depends on them. The Gold Coast rivalry continued long after Hudson was imprisoned. His removal did not reverse the territorial realignment that followed the ballroom blitz. The betrayal opened the gate, the violence exposed the struggle, the law reshaped the environment, but the cost of switching sides extended beyond club politics. It permanently altered the individuals involved and hardened the conflict's legacy. The next chapter of that legacy would surface years later, not in a ballroom, but in a driveway. The driveway execution.
Outlaw motorcycle gangs is back in court over the wild brawl. Nick the Knife Forbes fronted court for a second time over the infamous fight.
Well, it's been more than a decade since that infamous and violent...
The final violent echo of the ballroom blitz surfaced more than a decade later. In October 2020, Shane Bowden, the same figure who had shot Christopher Hudson inside Royal Pines Resort, was killed in the driveway of his Gold Coast home. He was shot 21 times while seated in his vehicle. The engine was still running when police arrived. Investigators later discovered a tracking device attached to his car. The killing was organized, deliberate, and precise, as Bowden had, in the years after the ballroom blitz, shifted affiliations again. After time in prison, he had patched over to the Mongols, the club that had absorbed the majority of former Finks members following the 2013 legislative crackdown. Internal disputes eventually led to his expulsion. Shortly before his death, he had reportedly reconnected with his original network. His assassination was not officially labeled a continuation of the 2006 rivalry, but context matters. Bowden had been a central actor in the public outbreak of violence at Royal Pines. He had symbolized retaliation for Hudson's defection. His death represented the persistence of unresolved tensions within and between clubs that had reshaped themselves over time. Law enforcement charged a senior Mongols member with organizing the hit, reinforcing the notion that internal instability had replaced overt inter-club confrontation as the dominant threat. The battlefield had changed again. Public brawls had given way to targeted eliminations. Bowden's death illustrated a defining pattern within outlaw motorcycle conflicts. Alliances shift, clubs restructure, legislation intervenes, but violence does not simply dissolve, it reconfigures. The ballroom blitz had marked the first public rupture in the Gold Coast turf war. Bowden's execution demonstrated that the consequences of that rupture continued to reverberate long after headlines faded. The war had evolved, the clubs had transformed, but the underlying principle, control enforced through violence, remained intact. The territory that changed hands.
18 months of that, and then his sentence was suspended, meaning he was released from jail on the condition that he couldn't commit another offence for a specific time period, otherwise he would have to serve out the rest of his time.
By the mid-2010s, the Gold Coast no longer reflected the power structure that existed before the ballroom blitz. The Finks, once the dominant force along the Glitter Strip, had been largely absorbed into the Mongols following the 2013 legislative crackdown. Their identity as the primary gatekeepers of the nightlife economy had dissolved into a broader amalgamation. The structural cohesion that once defined their presence fractured under legal pressure and internal reorganization. The Hells Angels, in contrast, had advanced incrementally. Their initial strategy relied on infiltration through Hudson's defection. After the public confrontation at Royal Pines, they reinforced local chapters and fortified their operational bases. By the time anti-bikie legislation disrupted rival networks, the Angels were already embedded. Law enforcement assessments in the years following the legislation indicated that the Hells Angels had become the most active outlaw motorcycle club operating on the Gold Coast. This shift was not achieved through a single confrontation. It unfolded across a decade. The ballroom fight exposed the rivalry. Subsequent retaliation cycles hardened divisions. Legislative intervention weakened the Finks' structure. The Mongols' patchover altered alignment, but did not restore former dominance. The Angels capitalized on fragmentation. Territorial control within outlaw motorcycle networks is rarely absolute. It is fluid, contested, and reinforced through visible and invisible pressure. Yet the strategic objective that motivated the initial infiltration, establishing presence in Australia's party capital, had been realized. The Gold Coast, once resistant to Hells Angels' expansion, had transitioned under their influence. The ballroom blitz was not merely a violent spectacle, it marked the pivot from resistance to realignment. What appeared as spontaneous chaos inside Royal Pines Resort was the outward expression of a deeper structural takeover. The Gold Coast turf war did not end in a negotiated settlement, it concluded in consolidation. The territory that triggered the conflict ultimately shifted, not in a single night, but through sustained pressure, adaptation, and attrition. Why the ballroom blitz was inevitable. The violence at Royal Pines was not an accident of proximity. It was the predictable collision point of competing expansion models operating in confined territory. By 2006, the Finks had built a vertically integrated presence along the Gold Coast, controlling segments of nightlife security, narcotics distribution, and enforcement through intimidation. Their authority relied on visible dominance. The Hells Angels approached expansion differently. They favored structural penetration through patchovers and incremental footholds, eroding rivals from within before asserting presence publicly. Hudson's defection compressed these two models into direct conflict. Once a senior insider aligned with the Angels, the Finks faced an existential threat: loss of internal cohesion. The Royal Pines event provided a rare shared space where symbolic allegiance was visible. A defector seated openly with a rival club inside contested territory was not merely provocative, it represented strategic encroachment. In outlaw motorcycle hierarchies, perceived weakness invites further encroachment. Failing to respond risked signaling vulnerability to both rivals and internal members. Retaliation inside the ballroom was not an emotional reaction alone, it was a performance of control. The Angels' presence at the event served a similar purpose. Visibility communicates strength. The confined environment amplified escalation. Large gatherings reduced the buffer zones that normally separate rival groups. Alcohol, interstate affiliates, and accumulated hostility further destabilized restraint. Once the first strike occurred, withdrawal was unlikely. Neither organization could afford retreat in a public setting filled with witnesses. The inevitability lay in the structural tension preceding the event. Territory under pressure, a defector amplifying vulnerability. Rival expansion strategies are converging. The ballroom did not create hostility. It exposed it under conditions where both sides were compelled to act. The result was not a random eruption. It was the first overt confrontation in a campaign that had already begun quietly. The violence that followed did not surprise those embedded in the conflict. It confirmed what the underlying dynamics had been building toward since late 2004. Control beyond the clubhouse.
To engage those that had been involved in the fight. Police wouldn't comment on camera today, but they did move to defend their response time, saying that units were here within 2 to 4 minutes.
After the ballroom blitz, the conflict no longer centered on direct physical confrontation alone. Control of the Gold Coast shifted into subtler arenas. Nightclub security contracts became leverage points. Gym affiliations signaled alignment. Tattoo studios functioned as both social hubs and recruitment channels. The battle moved from open brawls to economic positioning. Outlaw motorcycle clubs do not operate solely through violence. They operate through influence. Visibility within nightlife spaces reinforces territorial presence. If a club controls security at major venues, it influences who enters, who operates inside, and how disputes are handled. That influence converts into revenue and loyalty. After 2006, the competition for these positions intensified. The Hells Angels' fortified base in Burleigh Heads reflected a long-term strategy rather than a reactive posture. Surveillance infrastructure, controlled access, and centralized meeting points created operational stability. Consolidation replaced impulsive confrontation. The goal was endurance, not spectacle. The former Finks, now largely under the Mongols' banner, faced structural challenges, adapting to legislative pressure while maintaining Gold Coast dominance. Mergers can increase manpower, but dilute cohesion. Realignment requires rebuilding command chains and reasserting territorial signals. During this transition, gaps emerge. The Angels expanded through those gaps. Law enforcement attention also reshaped behavior. Public confrontations attracted immediate scrutiny. Clubs recalibrated toward lower visibility methods of control. Economic dominance became more valuable than public intimidation. The legacy of the ballroom blitz was not continued ballroom violence. It was a strategic recalibration. The Gold Coast turf war matured from explosive rivalry into sustained positioning. The contest for territory extended beyond physical fights into layered influence across nightlife infrastructure. Control no longer requires open confrontation at every stage. It required a presence that could not easily be displaced. By this stage, the war had shifted form. The violence that once erupted in a ballroom had evolved into structural entrenchment across the city's underworld economy. The reputation factor. Within outlaw motorcycle culture, reputation functions as currency. Territory is defended not only through physical control, but through perception. The ballroom blitz altered that perception permanently. For the Finks, it demonstrated that their internal ranks could fracture, and that rivals were willing to confront them publicly within their own sphere of influence. For the Hells Angels, it signaled willingness to absorb risk in pursuit of expansion. Reputation influences recruitment, alliances, and deterrence. A club perceived as dominant attracts affiliates seeking protection or opportunity. A club perceived as vulnerable invites testing. After Royal Pines, neither organization could afford to appear diminished. Each subsequent action, whether overt or calculated, reinforced narrative control. The Hells Angels leveraged interstate backing to maintain credibility. The reinforcement of their Gold Coast presence through nomadic appointments and fortified premises sent a visible signal of permanence. The Finks' large-scale patchover to the Mongols, while legally strategic, also communicated transformation under pressure. In outlaw structures, transformation can be interpreted as adaptation or as capitulation, depending on who controls the narrative. The significance of the ballroom blitz extended beyond the injuries inflicted that night. It created a reference point. Every subsequent confrontation, arrest, or expansion effort was measured against that moment. It became the benchmark for aggression and retaliation on the Gold Coast. Law enforcement assessments reflected this reputational dynamic. Public violence raised political pressure. Political pressure produced legislation. Legislation reshaped alliances. Reputation, therefore, influenced not only club strategy, but state response. The turf war did not unfold solely through weapons. It unfolded through symbolic control of territory and narrative dominance. The ballroom blitz was not merely an outbreak of aggression. It was a reputational contest staged in front of thousands, forcing both sides to commit to a path they could no longer quietly reverse. Law enforcement's structural countermove. The scale and visibility of the ballroom blitz did more than intensify club rivalry. For the Hells Angels, it signaled willingness to absorb risk in pursuit of expansion. Reputation influences recruitment, alliances, and deterrence. A club perceived as dominant attracts affiliates seeking protection or opportunity. A club perceived as vulnerable invites testing. After Royal Pines, neither organization could afford to appear diminished. Each subsequent action, whether overt or calculated, reinforced narrative control. The Hells Angels leveraged interstate backing to maintain credibility. The reinforcement of their Gold Coast presence through nomadic appointments and fortified premises sent a visible signal of permanence. The Finks' large-scale patchover to the Mongols, while legally strategic, also communicated transformation under pressure. In outlaw structures, transformation can be interpreted as adaptation or as capitulation, depending on who controls the narrative. The significance of the ballroom blitz extended beyond the injuries inflicted that night. It created a reference point. Every subsequent confrontation, arrest, or expansion effort was measured against that moment. It became the benchmark for aggression and retaliation on the Gold Coast. Law enforcement assessments reflected this reputational dynamic. Public violence raised political pressure. Political pressure produced legislation. Legislation reshaped alliances. Reputation, therefore, influenced not only club strategy, but state response. The turf war did not unfold solely through weapons. It unfolded through symbolic control of territory and narrative dominance. The ballroom blitz was not merely an outbreak of aggression. It was a reputational contest staged in front of thousands, forcing both sides to commit to a path they could no longer quietly reverse. Law enforcement's structural countermove.
Rival bikie gangs, the Finks and the Hells Angels. Nick the Knife Forbes faced court today over his role in the infamous attack. Why now after...
The scale and visibility of the ballroom blitz did more than intensify club rivalry. It forced institutional recalibration. Queensland law enforcement had long monitored outlaw motorcycle networks, but Royal Pines demonstrated the potential for large-scale violence in public venues. Intelligence operations shifted from reactive investigation to proactive disruption. Organized crime squads increased surveillance of known clubhouses, affiliated businesses, and interstate travel patterns. Data sharing between state units expanded. Financial tracking intensified. Rather than focusing solely on individual assaults, authorities began mapping association networks and revenue flows. The objective was structural interruption. The 2013 Vicious Lawless Association Disestablishment Act represented the culmination of this approach. By targeting membership itself, the legislation aimed to undermine the collective identity that enabled coordinated action. Mandatory sentencing enhancements and anti-association provisions forced clubs to reconsider public visibility and recruitment models. This legal pressure altered behavioral patterns. Public confrontations became liabilities rather than demonstrations of strength. Meetings shifted. Communication methods adapted. Some members disengaged. Others realigned under different banners. The Finks patchover to the Mongols was partially a response to this new environment. For the Hells Angels, adaptation required balancing visibility with durability. Fortified premises and tightened internal discipline reduced exposure while preserving authority. Expansion no longer relied on spectacle. It relied on endurance under scrutiny. The ballroom blitz did not create the legislation, but it accelerated political momentum behind it. Public fear converted into policy. Policy reconfigured the battlefield. In this phase of the turf war, violence remained present, but its expression narrowed. The struggle for the Gold Coast evolved into a contest of survival under regulatory pressure. Control would no longer be asserted through open brawls alone. It would be tested through resilience within a constrained legal landscape. The economics beneath the violence. The public focus of the ballroom blitz centered on gunfire and chaos. Beneath that spectacle lay the core motive: economic control. The Gold Coast was not merely symbolic territory. It functioned as a revenue corridor, linking supply chains from interstate sources to concentrated nightlife consumption zones. Cocaine distribution, synthetic drugs, private security contracts, and informal taxation of associated businesses generated sustained cash flow. For the Finks, control of these channels provided leverage. Enforcement teams collected debts. Security placements ensured influence inside venues. The club's authority translated into economic insulation. When the Hells Angels targeted the Gold Coast, the objective was not only prestige, it was revenue capture. Hudson's defection threatened operational secrecy. Knowledge of collection patterns, supply routes, and member responsibilities is more valuable than street presence alone. When he patched over, the Angels gained insight into how money moved. That insight altered competitive balance. After the ballroom blitz, economic positioning intensified quietly. Securing security contracts meant influencing venue management. Establishing legitimate front businesses created financial buffers. Clubs diversified their investments to withstand legal scrutiny. The rivalry shifted from overt confrontation towards strategic economic infiltration. Legislation disrupted some revenue channels but did not eliminate demand. Where formal association risked prosecution, indirect control methods emerged. Influence extended through affiliated individuals rather than visible patches. Territory remained linked to money, and money continued to shape alignment. The eventual consolidation of the Hells Angels' presence on the Gold Coast reflected economic persistence. They did not simply outfight rivals, they outlasted them within a shifting regulatory framework. The Finks' structural dissolution under Mongols' colors fragmented prior revenue networks, creating openings. The ballroom blitz was a visible rupture. The economic contest beneath it was sustained and methodical. Control of the glitter strip was never about one confrontation. It was about who could embed influence deeply enough to endure beyond public violence and legal intervention. The outcome reflected that endurance, fragmentation, and realignment. As the legislative crackdown tightened and the Finks transitioned into the Mongols' structure, fragmentation reshaped the Gold Coast power map. Large-scale patchovers can preserve manpower, but they disrupt established chains of command. Loyalty is not automatically transferred with a change of colors. Internal hierarchies must be renegotiated. Authority must be reasserted. During that transition, instability emerges. The Mongols' absorption of former Finks members created a numerically strong presence, but cohesion required time. Interstate coordination had to be aligned with local expectations. Existing rivalries did not disappear simply because the banner changed. The Hells Angels remained in direct competition for the same territory, and the symbolic memory of royal pines lingered. Fragmentation also affects enforcement capacity. When leadership shifts, enforcement units recalibrate. Financial streams are reallocated. Some members resist the new direction. Others seek advantage within the reshuffle. In such environments, decisive expansion becomes possible for a rival with established infrastructure. The Hells Angels had already reinforced their Gold Coast presence before the legislative disruption reached its peak. Fortified premises in Burleigh Heads provided a stable anchor point. International backing ensured structural continuity. While rivals reorganized, the Angels focused on consolidation. This period marked a transition from overt turf war to competitive endurance. The violence became less theatrical, more targeted. Law enforcement pressure discouraged large-scale public clashes. Instead, positioning unfolded through quiet reinforcement of territory and influence. Fragmentation did not eliminate hostility, it redistributed it. Alliances became conditional. Former rivals occasionally intersected within new configurations. The legacy of the ballroom blitz persisted beneath these shifts, influencing perception and caution. The Gold Coast was no longer a binary battlefield between two fixed entities. It had become a layered contest among reorganized factions. In that environment, stability favored the group with deeper structural resilience, and resilience was becoming the decisive factor. The myth of a single night.
Rival bikie gangs, the Finks and the Hells Angels. Nick the Knife Forbes faced court today over his role in the infamous attack. Why now after...
Public memory often reduces the Gold Coast turf war to the violence inside Royal Pines Resort. The ballroom blitz is frequently framed as the beginning and defining moment of the conflict. In reality, it was neither the origin nor the conclusion. It was a visible rupture in a process already underway. Territorial competition between the Hells Angels and the Finks began years before 2006 through infiltration, surveillance, and retaliatory attacks. Drive-by shootings in 2005 signaled that escalation had already moved beyond rhetoric. The ballroom incident did not create hostility. It revealed it under public conditions that forced exposure. Likewise, the Blitz did not resolve the conflict. Sentences were handed down, media coverage surged, yet retaliation cycles continued. Legislative intervention reshaped alliances. The Finks dissolved into the Mongols. The Hells Angels consolidated their presence. The conflict migrated from spectacle to structure. Reducing the turf war to a single night obscures the strategic mechanics that drove it. Expansion required patience, entrenchment required reinforcement, legislative survival required adaptation. Violence was one tool among several. The persistence of targeted killings years later, including the 2020 driveway execution of Shane Bowden, demonstrates that the rivalry's consequences extended beyond the ballroom. Alliances shifted. Individuals changed affiliations. Yet, the structural imprint of the original confrontation remained. The ballroom blitz holds symbolic weight because it exposed the war publicly. It does not define the totality of the war. The deeper transformation occurred across a decade through territorial recalibration, economic repositioning, and legal restructuring. Understanding the Gold Coast turf war requires looking beyond the spectacle of chairs and gunshots. The real contest unfolded in slow consolidation and adaptive endurance. The ballroom was the flashpoint, but the war was structural from the beginning. The balance of power. By the late 2010s, the Gold Coast's outlaw motorcycle landscape had settled into a new equilibrium. The Finks, once dominant along the Glitter Strip, no longer existed in their original form. Their absorption into the Mongols diluted the centralized authority they had exercised during the early 2000s. The Mongols maintained presence, but the cohesion and territorial insulation that once defined the Finks' control had fragmented. The Hells Angels, in contrast, had achieved what they pursued since Hudson's defection in 2004, sustained operational presence in Australia's party capital. law enforcement assessments identified them as the most active club on the Gold Coast after anti-bikie legislation weakened rival structures. Their expansion was not marked by a single decisive victory. It unfolded incrementally through infiltration, reinforcement, and endurance under legal scrutiny. This shift did not eliminate competition. Australia remains home to dozens of outlaw motorcycle clubs with thousands of patched members nationwide. The Gold Coast continues to be a contested space in varying degrees, but the balance of influence no longer resembled the pre-2006 landscape. The ballroom blitz functioned as the first visible fracture in Finks' dominance. Legislative disruption accelerated structural change. Targeted violence reinforced reputational consequences. Over time, these elements converged into territorial realignment. Control in outlaw motorcycle networks is rarely absolute. It is measured in access, influence, and sustained presence. By that measure, the Hells Angels had secured a strategic foothold where they previously lacked one. The Finks' former authority over the glitter strip had dissipated. The turf war did not conclude with a treaty or formal acknowledgement. It concluded through attrition and adaptation. The balance shifted quietly after the noise subsided. What began as infiltration ended as consolidation, and the transformation of the Gold Coast's underworld traced directly back to the fracture exposed inside Royal Pines Resort. The structural outcome, the question underlying the Gold Coast turf wars, is not who threw the first punch inside Royal Pines. It is whether the ballroom blitz achieved what it set into motion. When examined structurally, the answer becomes clear. The violence did not deter expansion, it accelerated it. Christopher Hudson's defection gave the Hells Angels an operational foothold. The public confrontation at Royal Pines eliminated ambiguity about territorial intent. Retaliation cycles hardened the rivalry. Legislative intervention destabilized the Finks framework. The large-scale patchover to the Mongols fragmented their original authority. Through each stage, the Angels adjusted rather than retreated. The transformation did not occur overnight. It required reinforcement of local chapters, interstate coordination, and resilience under intensified police scrutiny. Yet by the mid-2010s, the balance of influence along the Gold Coast had shifted. Law enforcement assessments reflected that shift. The Angels had become the most active club in a region once resistant to their presence. The ballroom blitz was not simply a violent spectacle, it was the moment when covert expansion became overt conflict. From that point forward, the struggle moved beyond infiltration into consolidation. Every subsequent development, legislative shockwaves, realignments, targeted killings, war for the glitter strip was never about one night. It was about who could sustain pressure longer, adapt faster, and endure structural disruption. By that measure, the outcome is visible. The brutal confrontation at Royal Pines did not stop the Hells Angels from entering the Gold Coast. It marked the beginning of their consolidation within it. What the ballroom blitz actually proved. Inside the Gold Coast turf wars, Hells Angels versus Finks, the brutal ballroom blitz, explained, was never about a spontaneous fight at a kickboxing tournament. It was about whether a public eruption of violence could fracture an entrenched power structure. The answer lies in what followed. Before March 18, 2006, the Finks controlled the Gold Coast's criminal infrastructure. They held the territory. They managed the revenue streams. The Hells Angels were outsiders attempting penetration through defection and recruitment. Hudson's patchover was the breach. Royal Pines made that breach irreversible. The ballroom blitz forced the rivalry into full visibility. It exposed the territorial contest to national scrutiny. It triggered sustained retaliation. It intensified law enforcement focus. And it accelerated legislative reform that would ultimately destabilize the Finks structure. When the vicious Lawless Association disestablishment laws reshaped Queensland's outlaw landscape in 2013, the Finks were structurally vulnerable. Their mass patchover to the Mongols was not an expansion. It was preservation. Their identity dissolved under legal pressure. The Hells Angels, already fortified and reinforced, endured. They consolidated their presence in Burleigh Heads. They absorbed the vacuum created by weakened rivals. Law enforcement assessments later confirmed their operational dominance along the Gold Coast. The brutal ballroom blitz was not decisive because of who was shot or stabbed. It was decisive because it marked the irreversible transition from attempted infiltration to territorial consolidation. The Gold Coast was not won in a single night. It was reshaped by the structural consequences that night set in motion. The turf war did not end with applause fading in a ballroom. It ended when the power balance permanently shifted, and that shift began at Royal Pines. Blood debt and the long memory of the Gold Coast. The Gold Coast turf war did not end when court sentences were handed down, nor when anti-bikie laws were passed, nor even when the Finks dissolved into the Mongols. It persisted in memory and in blood. In outlaw motorcycle networks, reputations are currency. Betrayal, retaliation, and public humiliation are not easily erased. The ballroom blitz created more than criminal charges. It created unfinished business. Shane Bowden embodied that unfinished thread. In 2006, he was identified as the man who shot Christopher Hudson during the Royal Pines melee. The act was framed as retribution for defection. At the time, it reinforced the Finks' refusal to accept Hudson's betrayal. Bowden was later sentenced and served prison time. But prison sentences do not dissolve reputational debts within outlaw structures. They often deepen them. Years later, after the Finks patched over to the Mongols, Bowden's own affiliations shifted. He aligned with the Mongols, then was expelled amid internal disputes, and eventually rejoined the Finks shortly before his death. These movements were not casual membership changes. They reflected the instability that large-scale amalgamations create. Loyalty becomes layered, allegiances become conditional. Old conflicts remain active beneath new colors. In October 2020, Bowden was shot 21 times in the driveway of his Gold Coast home. A tracking device was reportedly found beneath his vehicle. The method suggested planning rather than impulsive retaliation. The execution linked directly back to the long arc of Gold Coast hostilities. Although years had passed since the ballroom blitz, the rivalry's structural tensions had not disappeared. Law enforcement charged a Mongols chapter president with organizing the hit. The killing illustrated how internal fractures and interclub rivalries can intersect. Bowden had once fired shots inside Royal Pines. 14 years later, he was the target. The cycle had reversed. This is the dimension often overlooked in surface-level accounts of the turf war. The ballroom blitz was not a contained event. It embedded grievances that extended across affiliations and decades. The Gold Coast conflict operated on extended timelines. Individuals moved between clubs, legislation reshaped identities, but memory persisted. Outlaw motorcycle culture enforces continuity through reputation. Public acts of violence are not forgotten. They are catalogued. They influence internal promotion, external perception, and retaliatory calculus. Bowden's killing was not simply another organized crime execution. It was part of a longer chain that began when Hudson crossed over to the Hells Angels, and a confrontation erupted at Royal Pines. The Gold Coast turf wars demonstrate that territorial conflict does not conclude with structural dominance alone. Even after power is consolidated, personal histories remain volatile. Alliances evolve. Clubs rebrand. But reputational debts remain active. The brutal ballroom blitz was the ignition point. The blood debt it created did not expire when the ballroom emptied. It continued, carried forward by individuals whose identities were shaped inside that conflict. On the Gold Coast, memory is operational, and it lasts longer than legislation. Control without spectacle. By the time the immediate violence of the Gold Coast turf wars subsided, the strategy had shifted. Public brawls like the brutal ballroom blitz were no longer the preferred arena for dominance. The cost was too visible. The legislative consequences were too severe. Control moved away from spectacle and into structure. After 2013, Queensland's anti-association laws forced outlaw motorcycle clubs to operate under unprecedented scrutiny. Clubhouses were monitored, movements were tracked, public gatherings carried legal risk, visibility became a liability. The organizations that survived were those capable of adapting quietly. For the Hells Angels, consolidation on the Gold Coast required discipline rather than dramatic confrontation. Premises were fortified, security systems were installed, access became controlled. Influence operated through networks rather than open intimidation. The absence of public brawls did not indicate peace. It indicated recalibration. The Mongols, strengthened numerically by absorbing the Finks, faced the challenge of integrating former rivals under one banner. That integration required internal enforcement. Authority had to be re-established without attracting enforcement attention. Fragmented loyalties had to be managed. In environments shaped by distrust, consolidation is delicate. Control in this phase meant regulating revenue streams rather than defending territory with visible violence. Drug distribution channels, nightclub affiliations, and peripheral businesses became the primary battlegrounds. Reputation still mattered, but overt displays were increasingly replaced by targeted enforcement and selective retaliation. Law enforcement assessments during this period reflected a measurable shift. The Hells Angels were described as the most active club on the Gold Coast, following legislative disruption of rivals. Activity did not mean public conflict. It meant sustained presence and operational continuity. The transition from spectacle to structure marks the final phase of the Gold Coast turf wars. The brutal ballroom blitz represented a visible rupture. The years that followed represented strategic absorption. Expansion was no longer about confrontation at ringside. It was about endurance under pressure. The conflict did not vanish, it transformed. Public perception moved on from Royal Pines, but structural positioning continued quietly. Territory is not always taken in a single moment. It is often secured through sustained presence while rivals reorganize. Inside the Gold Coast turf wars, Hells Angels versus Finks, the brutal ballroom blitz, explained, ultimately reveals that dominance was not decided by who stood last in the ballroom. It was determined by who adapted after the violence faded, and in that quiet phase, the balance remained altered. The cost of expansion. Territorial expansion within outlaw motorcycle networks is rarely linear. It demands infiltration, confrontation, retaliation, and endurance. The Gold Coast provided a concentrated example of that progression. For the Hells Angels, entry into the region required more than symbolic presence. It required absorbing the consequences of resistance. The defection of Christopher Hudson created an entry point, but it also guaranteed retaliation. His knowledge of Finks's operations was valuable intelligence, yet it came at the cost of escalation. The ballroom blitz demonstrated how quickly internal betrayal could ignite public violence. From that moment forward, expansion carried reputational stakes on both sides. Drive-by shootings in 2005, the melee at Royal Pines in 2006, and the retaliatory cycles that followed illustrate that expansion is paid for incrementally. Injuries, prison sentences, and long-term surveillance are structural costs. Legislative intervention in 2013 further complicated the calculus. The Vicious Lawless Association disestablishment laws imposed mandatory sentences and heavy restrictions on members of designated organizations. Expansion now requires operating under intensified risk. For the Finks, defending territory also demanded cost absorption. The attempt to maintain dominance through confrontation contributed to sustained law enforcement pressure. The eventual patch over to the Mongols was not merely a strategic alliance, it reflected the cumulative strain of maintaining independent control under legislative threat. The Hells Angels endured similar scrutiny, but retained structural continuity. Their international framework provided reinforcement and coordination beyond the Gold Coast. That depth insulated them during legal disruption. While rivals restructured, the Angels consolidated. The cost of expansion is not measured solely in casualties, it is measured in resilience. The club that can withstand enforcement pressure, internal fragmentation, and reputational backlash is the one that remains operational. The brutal ballroom blitz was a visible price paid during expansion. It exposed the rivalry publicly and accelerated legal consequences. But it also clarified intent. The Hells Angels were no longer testing the Gold Coast, they were contesting it openly. What the Gold Coast turf wars ultimately revealed. Inside the Gold Coast turf wars, Hells Angels versus Finks, the brutal ballroom blitz explained, was never about who landed the first blow inside Royal Pines Resort. It was about whether that violence marked a failed incursion or the beginning of irreversible territorial change. The evidence points in one direction. Before 2006, the Finks controlled the Gold Coast's underworld infrastructure. They held the networks, the revenue streams, and the street authority. The Hells Angels were attempting entry through recruitment and defection. Christopher Hudson's patchover was the breach. The ballroom blitz was the public confirmation that the breach could not be undone. From that night forward, the rivalry intensified, but so did structural pressure. Retaliation drew attention. Attention brought legislative reform. The 2013 anti-bikie laws destabilized established hierarchies. The Finks, once dominant, dissolved into the Mongols under legal strain. Their independent control ended not with a single defeat, but through cumulative erosion. The Hells Angels endured the same legislative environment without dissolving. They fortified premises, reinforced interstate coordination, and maintained presence while rivals reorganized. Law enforcement assessments in subsequent years reflected the shift. The Angels became the most active club on the Gold Coast after anti-bikie laws weakened competitors. The brutal ballroom blitz did not win the territory in one night. It exposed the conflict in a way that forced acceleration. It transformed infiltration into open war. It locked reputations into motion. And it set off structural changes that reshaped Queensland's outlaw landscape.